Hello, everyone. Today we're going to talk about some Supreme Court cases and new laws that came out during this time. And this is just a kind of reminder of an old court case that was very important, but it's called Plessy versus Ferguson. And this Supreme Court case in 1896 said separate but equal. Whites and blacks went to segregated, which means separate facilities. This includes schools, parks, water fountains. And although Plessy versus Ferguson said separate but equal, things were not equal. Here's an example of the water fountain. White people had a nice one that was air conditioned, it was cool. And if you were not white, you had this water fountain, which wasn't refrigerated. This is also an African American school. It's one room, multiple ages. Whereas white people had better schools at the time. And that's because of Plessy versus Ferguson. But things are going to start changing and become better for African American and Americans. Things will be more equal. And that's going to start with the Brown versus Board of Education. And this was a Supreme Court decision in 1954 that said segregated schools are unequal and must desegregate. So segregate is to separate, desegregate is to bring together. So schools have to have both black and white students. In this case, reversed Plessy versus Ferguson. It said separate but equal is illegal. And this also included the case of Davis versus County School Board of Prince Edward. So Plessy versus Ferguson is what separated people, but later on the Supreme Court said you can no longer do that. All kids go to the same school, doesn't matter what race you are. Some important people in the Brown versus Board of Education case. One was Barbara Johns, who our school is partially named after her. She was a student leader in Prince Edward County, and she was a black student who did not want to have separate schools. Thurgood Marshall, who Justice High School is also partially named after. And he was the NCAA legal defense team. He was a lawyer for the NAACP. He later became a Supreme Court justice. And then Oliver Hill, he was the NAACP legal defense team in Virginia. And then Earl Warren was the Supreme Court Chief Justice of this case. And now Virginia's response to the Brown versus Board of Education, there was massive resistance. A lot of white people did not want their children going to school with black children. And Virginia just flat out closed some schools because they didn't want that to happen. There started to be an establishment of private academies. So white people paid for their kids to go to schools with no black kids. So they just went to private school instead of public school. And there's something called white flight from urban school systems to suburbs. So white people moved away from cities to places where few black people lived. And this happened, this is an example in Baltimore. You can see the percent of the population of Baltimore was white. But when they started desegregating schools, white people left the city, moved to the suburbs, and the percentage of blacks increased. And the NAACP is the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. And they challenged segregation in the courts. The association had a long history of working to overturn the Plessy versus Ferguson decision. So they wanted to get rid of it. These are pictures of some of the people protesting. They protest segregation. They don't like being separated. And then there's the 1963 March on Washington. Participants were inspired by the I Have a Dream speech given by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. In his I Have a Dream speech, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. talked about how everyone should be equal. And the march helped influence public opinion to support civil rights legislation. A lot of people started believing everyone should be equal. And the march demonstrated the power of nonviolent mass protest. So you can make change without being violent. This is the march right here. A lot of people wanted to see Martin Luther King. And as you can see, this is DC, the Washington Power. It was absolutely packed. There was lots of people there. And this led to the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And this prohibited discrimination based on race, color, religion, gender, or national origin. So you can't treat people different because of their race, religion, color, or country where they come from. It desegregated public accommodations. So Brown versus Board Education was strictly just schools, but the Civil Rights Act of 1964 desegregated all public things like hotels, restaurants, movie theaters. And President Lyndon B. Johnson played an important role in the passage of this act. Then later on, there's the Voting Rights Act of 1965. It outlawed literacy tests. So you can't make people test to vote. Earlier in the year, I gave you guys a literacy test. Nobody in the class passed it. It was almost an impossible test to pass. So it was very difficult for African Americans to pass it. So it made it illegal. Federal registers were sent to the South to register voters. And this resulted in an increase in African American voters. And Lyndon Johnson also played an important role in the passage of the act. Then there's the American Disabilities Act. It's also called the Section 504, the Rehabilitation Act in 1973, and prohibited discrimination on the basis of disability in federal programs and by receipts of federal financial assistance. And the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, IDEA, requires that all children with disabilities receive a free, appropriate public education in the least restrictive environment. So this just says if you have a disability, people need to build things like ramps, but also you have to get a free public education, just like any other kid. Doesn't matter if you have a disability. So the Supreme Court, we're going to talk about that. The membership of the United States Supreme Court during the end of the 20th century and early 21st century has included women and minorities such as Sandra Day O'Connor, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Clarence Thomas, Sonia Sotomayor, and Elena Kagan. And the United States Supreme Court protects individual rights enumerated in the Constitution of the United States. So the Supreme Court, that's the third branch of the United States government, their job is to protect the Constitution, to make sure laws are protecting people. And it used to be nothing but white men, but now it's slowly changing. You're starting to have minorities, you're starting to have women. So we're going to talk about some important Supreme Court cases. The United States Supreme Court identifies a constitutional basis for the right to privacy that is protected from government interference. And some important cases are Roe v. Wade, and this established the precedent of the right to privacy. But it's most famous because it made abortion legal and said people have privacy with their doctor. So now if a female becomes pregnant, they do have the option to have an abortion. The next case is Riley v. California. It protects the privacy of digital information on cell phones. So police can't search your phone without a search warrant. So if a police officer has to see your cell phone, you can't say no, they need to get a warrant to look at it. The civil rights movement in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s provided a model that other minority groups have used to extend civil rights. Here is Loving v. Virginia. It protected equal rights for individuals, struck down state laws that prohibited interracial marriage, and held marriage was a fundamental right. So this just meant people of different color were allowed to get married. There was some places where if there was a black man and a white woman, they weren't allowed to get married. But this said you have to allow anyone to get married. That was a man and a woman. Didn't matter what color their skin was. And next is Arizona versus Intertribal Council of Arizona. It invalidated a state law requiring proof of citizenship during the voter registration application process. So you don't need proof of citizenship when you register to vote. And then a principle under which all persons, institutions, and entities are accountable to their laws. So this is regarding rule of law. First one is Gideon versus Wainwright. It requires states to provide counsel for needy defendants charged with serious offenses. So if you're ever arrested, you get a free lawyer if charged with a crime. So remember, just because you're arrested, it doesn't mean you committed a crime. You still have a trial to go to, and now you get a lawyer for free if you're ever arrested. And Snyder versus Phelps is the last one, and this upholds that protests of public concern are entitled to greater protection under the free speech clause of the First Amendment. Essentially, Phelps has a church called the Westboro Baptist Church, and they're known for going to funerals of dead soldiers, and they protest, and a lot of people do not like them. They say a lot of offensive things, but the Supreme Court says the First Amendment is free speech, so you have to protect that. So people are allowed to protest at funerals was the big thing with that. All right, that's it for today. If you guys have any other questions, let me know.